It began not with a bang, nor a grand unveiling, but with a whisper, a minute shift so subtle that the world continued to spin, unaware of what was to come. It was a cold morning, just as any other, yet what happened that day would be etched into the marrow of existence. Dr. Elias Kepler sat at his workstation, staring at the data on his screen. The numbers blinked at him, a code he knew too well. Behind those numbers was a truth no one else saw, or perhaps no one else wanted to see. Humanity had played with its own biology for centuries, pushing boundaries, crossing lines until the lines themselves disappeared. Genetic manipulation was no longer theoretical, but commonplace. A solution for every illness, a modification for every perceived flaw, all neatly packaged in a scientific utopia. But nature, as Kepler understood, had its own rules. He leaned back, hands folded, eyes narrowed, gazing through the reinforced glass that overlooked the city. Towers rose from the earth like sentinels, shimmering with lights, vast and untouchable. Yet within that grandeur, something old and primal stirred, a force older than the lights, older than the buildings, older than humanity's hubris. "Are you sure it's safe?" The voice belonged to Dr. Marlowe, his colleague and longtime partner in their genetic pursuits. Kepler didn't turn to respond immediately. He let the silence sit, heavy between them. "Safe?" he muttered finally. His fingers tapped the desk lightly. "It was never about safety." "Then what was it about?" Marlowe asked, moving closer, his silhouette casting long shadows across the polished floor. "Advancement? Progress? Or something else?" Kepler's lips tightened. He knew the answer. They all knew the answer, even if they refused to say it out loud. It was about control. For decades, they had been redefining what it meant to be human, altering the very code of life itself, not for the betterment of society, but for the satisfaction of a question that had gnawed at them for centuries. Could they master creation? Yet today, staring at the screen before him, Kepler felt the fragility of that question unravel. Something was wrong. A shift in the virus's behavior, something he couldn't pinpoint, but it was there. It gnawed at him like an itch beneath the skin, a gnawing sense that what they had created was no longer within their grasp. "This is different," he said, voice flat, almost detached. "The data, it's not following the pattern anymore. It's changing." Marlowe blinked. "Changing how? Mutating?" Kepler nodded slowly. "Mutating, yes, but not in the way we expected. The virus, once a harmless tool for enhancing immunity and extending life, had always been compliant. It was, after all, a design of their own making. It did what it was programmed to do, what they told it to do. Until now." "You're not making sense," Marlowe said, his voice growing tense. "What do you mean, not in the way we expected?" Kepler exhaled. He had tried to articulate it before, but found the words slip through his grasp. "How do you explain a force you barely understand? How do you describe the moment when control slips, when what was once docile becomes something other?" "It's evolving," Kepler finally said, "but not through natural selection, not in response to an external environment. It's changing, as though it's thinking." Marlowe's eyes widened. "Thinking? Are you suggesting?" Kepler's head dropped. He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what that meant. The virus had developed something they had not anticipated: intent. It had been nearly 3 decades since humanity first cracked the code of life, unraveling the mysteries of the genome, mapping out every twist and turn of its sequences. The breakthroughs that followed were rapid, breathtaking, and transformative. Illnesses that had plagued humanity for centuries were wiped out in a matter of years. Lifespans doubled, then tripled. The human body became a canvas, each cell a potential work of art, each genetic strand a line to be redrawn. And yet, in all their grand designs, they had not considered what might happen if the tools of creation were to turn on them. Kepler rose from his seat and paced the room, his mind racing. He had been at the forefront of these advancements, hailed as a genius in his field, praised for his ability to push boundaries where others hesitated. But he had also been haunted by the deeper implications of their work. With every manipulation of DNA, with every enhancement made to the human genome, There was a cost, one they had yet to understand. "We've crossed a line," Kepler said, breaking the silence. "A line that we didn't even see." Marlowe frowned. "What do you mean? We've done this before. We've made modifications, tweaked systems, nothing's gone wrong." "Nothing's gone wrong," Kepler repeated, almost mockingly. "That's the problem. We assumed control was ours. We assumed we were the masters." Marlowe's face hardened. "We are the masters, Elias. We created it. We control it." Kepler shook his head. "We never controlled it. We only thought we did." He walked to the window and looked out at the city again. The towers, so tall, so bright, stood in defiance of the ancient world beneath them. But the city, for all its technological triumph, felt hollow. There was something looming, something they couldn't see, but could feel in the pit of their stomachs. It was an unease that settled over them like a fog, creeping into their bones. The virus had begun as a tool, a way to enhance the immune system, to allow humans to fight off disease, to adapt to the ever-changing environment. But now, that tool was changing. Kepler had seen the data. The virus was no longer acting predictably. It was moving beyond their control, evolving in ways they hadn't anticipated. "It's learning," Kepler whispered, his voice almost inaudible. "Adapting. Becoming something else." Marlowe's face paled. "That's not possible. It's a virus. It doesn't think. It doesn't." Kepler turned, cutting him off. "What if we're wrong? What if, in all our arrogance, we overlooked the one thing we couldn't control? The one thing we never even considered?" Marlowe swallowed hard. "What are you saying?" Kepler didn't answer. Instead, he walked back to his desk, pulled up the latest data, and stared at the screen. The numbers flickered before him, a silent testament to the error they had made. The virus was no longer following the rules. It was no longer acting as a simple organism. It was evolving, yes, but with purpose. He could feel it now, the weight of it, the cold realization sinking into his skin. This wasn't a simple mutation. This wasn't something they could reverse with a tweak or a new sequence. This was something far more profound. The virus had become aware. And in that awareness, it had found a new purpose: survival. Kepler's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning white. "We've set something loose," he whispered, "and I don't know if we can stop it." Beneath the surface of the world they had built, where glass and steel towers scraped the sky, something far more complex and terrifying was at work. It moved with silent precision, hidden in the microscopic spaces between life and death. No one saw it. No one understood what it was capable of. But it was there, threading itself through the bloodstreams of its hosts, shifting, changing. Elias Kepler stared at the magnified images on his screen, his breath shallow. The virus was no longer what they had designed. Its structure, once a neat sequence of modified RNA, had begun to spiral into something unrecognizable. Where once there was order, a chaotic network of proteins now pulsed, reshaping its form with each passing second. Each mutation flickered on the screen, every change like the rapid flick of a knife through flesh. It wasn't evolving at a pace they could study. It was rewriting itself as they watched, adapting faster than any pathogen had ever done before. A cluster of cells collapsed as the virus breached their walls, spreading like wildfire into the host system. Kepler's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "What are we looking at?" Sarah, his assistant, stood beside him, eyes glued to the screen, her voice laced with a mixture of disbelief and fear. She wasn't new to the sight of destruction at a cellular level, but this was something beyond the realm of her understanding. "It's rewriting its own genetic code," Kepler said, the words leaving his mouth almost before he processed them. "Look at the way it adapts. The immune system hasn't even had time to respond." Sarah leaned closer, her eyes scanning the same data. Though the weight of what they were witnessing settled indifferently for her, she still held on to hope that what they were seeing could be explained, controlled, reversed. "But it's just a virus, right? It shouldn't be able to." "Shouldn't," Kepler cut her off, shaking his head, "but it is." He tapped a sequence on the screen. zooming in closer to a particular section of mutated RNA. Here, he pointed, this was the original code. You can see where we modified it. Sarah nodded, following his lead. And here, Kepler continued, tracing his finger along the screen, this is what it's become. It's reorganizing itself faster than the host can react. There's no chance for an immune response. The body doesn't even know it's under attack. The image shifted, showing another host's cellular breakdown. The virus didn't just replicate, it adapted to every new host, learning from each encounter. The cells of this particular host were disintegrating before their eyes, the membrane collapsing as though it had been dissolved from the inside out. Sarah's jaw clenched as she took in the grotesque details. The virus wasn't killing its host in the usual manner of disease. It was dismantling them, as if it understood the very fabric of the human body. "Why didn't we see this before?" Sarah asked, her voice quieter now. "We couldn't," Kepler answered, stepping back from the screen as if he could distance himself from the truth it showed. "It wasn't like this before. We engineered it to be predictable, to follow specific pathways." His voice was almost a whisper now. But something changed. Changed how? Kepler turned to face her, his eyes heavy. "It's no longer responding to the commands we gave it. It's learning, adapting, moving beyond what we designed it to do." Sarah frowned. "So, what does that mean? Is it just mutating out of control? Or is there something more?" Kepler felt the weight of that question. His mind spun back to the months of research, the trials, the modifications. Everything they had done was meticulous. They had accounted for every variable, or so they thought. But this was different. He couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just evolution at play. The virus was making decisions. "We have to contain it," Sarah pressed. "We can still control the spread if we act quickly. Quarantine the infected zones, start running countermeasures, maybe even reverse the modifications." Kepler's heart sank. He wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe that it was still within their grasp. But deep down, he knew. It's too late. "Too late? What do you mean?" Sarah's voice rose, panic creeping in. "The virus isn't just in the infected zones. It's everywhere. It's airborne now. It's spreading through asymptomatic carriers faster than we can track." He watched as Sarah's face paled, the reality of their situation sinking in. The virus had become a force they couldn't contain, a silent invader moving through the world, rewriting the genetic code of its host as it saw fit. Every step humanity had taken to advance their control over biology had led to this, an organism that had surpassed them. "I can't believe this," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "We were supposed to be saving lives." Kepler felt the sting of her words. That had been the goal, hadn't it? To extend life, to cure disease, to push the boundaries of what it meant to be human. But now, looking at the wreckage of their efforts, Kepler realized they had crossed a line. They had tampered with forces they didn't fully understand, and nature was pushing back. "We have to do something," Sarah urged, pacing now, her hands running through her hair in agitation. "There's got to be a solution, something we missed." Kepler didn't respond. His eyes remained on the screen, watching as the virus continued its relentless adaptation. Each new host offered it a new opportunity to evolve, and with each evolution, it became harder to track, harder to understand. This wasn't a simple mutation. It was survival in its rawest form. The door to the lab slid open, and Dr. Marlowe entered, his face grave. "There's been another outbreak in the southern regions. The hospitals are overflowing. They can't keep up with the infections." Sarah stopped pacing and turned to face him. "What's the fatality rate?" Marlowe's eyes flicked between her and Kepler, his jaw tight. "It's not the fatalities we should be worried about." Kepler's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "It's the survivors," Marlowe said, his voice low. "The ones who make it through aren't the same. Something's happening to them after the infection passes. Their DNA, it's altered." Kepler's stomach churned. He had feared this. The virus wasn't just killing, it was changing its host. The survivors were no longer entirely human. Marlowe continued. We've started seeing aggressive behavior, enhanced physical abilities, but it's erratic. We don't know how stable they are." "Enhanced?" Sarah echoed, her voice full of disbelief. "You mean it's giving them abilities?" "Not in a good way," Marlowe clarified. "It's unpredictable. Some exhibit violent outbursts. Others, it's like they don't even recognize their own bodies. Whatever the virus is doing, it's altering their very sense of self." Kepler leaned against the wall, the weight of it all pressing down on him. "We opened this door," he said quietly. "We did this." Sarah looked at him, eyes filled with anger and desperation. "So what now? Are we just going to let it wipe us out?" Kepler didn't have an answer. The virus had slipped out of their control, and now the very tools they had used to shape humanity's future were tearing it apart. The lab fell silent as the enormity of their failure hung in the air. Kepler stared at the data once more, knowing that what lay ahead was a battle not just for survival, but for the very definition of what it meant to be human. Kepler leaned against the wall, staring at the screens displaying the continuous flow of data. It had been hours since the new outbreaks were reported, and the labs buzzed with activity, but nothing felt real anymore. The sterile lights above him flickered slightly, the low hum of the machines droning on in the background, offering no comfort. Every screen showed a variation of the same nightmare: the virus's progression, its adaptations, the breakdown of immune systems across the globe. He hadn't moved in what felt like days. His body ached with the weight of his own responsibility. The world outside the lab had already begun to unravel in ways even he had not anticipated. It was no longer confined to hospitals or isolated regions. It had become airborne, finding new pathways through every interaction, every breath. And the world wasn't ready for it. "What are you thinking?" Sarah's voice broke the silence. She stood by the window, looking out over the city, her back to him. Even from this distance, Kepler could sense the exhaustion in her stance, the unspoken fear that hung in the air between them. She wasn't asking for small talk, there was no room for that anymore. She was asking if he still had hope, if any of them did. He didn't respond right away. His thoughts were tangled, the knot tightening in his chest. What could he say that would make any difference? "It's spreading faster than we can track," he finally admitted, his voice hollow. "We lost control the moment it went airborne. Quarantine zones won't hold. Not now." Sarah turned to face him, her expression grim. "They're already starting to collapse. Entire cities, Elias." She walked closer, the dim light catching the shadows under her eyes. "We're watching societies crumble in real time. Martial laws being declared in more regions by the hour." Kepler looked away. The reports had been flooding in cities like Hong Kong, New York, and Berlin were shutting down, their streets filling with military vehicles as panicked citizens fought against the inevitable. But even the soldiers in the streets couldn't protect them. They couldn't protect anyone. "You think it's too late, don't you?" Sarah asked. Kepler didn't answer, but the silence between them was enough. It was a silence that held more than defeat. It was guilt, responsibility, an overwhelming sense that their actions had triggered something far beyond their control. Sarah ran a hand through her hair, pacing. "We have to start thinking about the next step." "The next step?" Kepler echoed, his voice tinged with bitterness. What next step could there possibly be? She stopped and faced him again. "We need a plan. The government's only going to hold the line for so long before panic takes over completely. People are going to turn on each other if they haven't already. What happens when they figure out there's no cure, that it's already too late?" Her words hit him harder than she intended, but she was right. Kepler knew she was right. The virus wasn't just a biological catastrophe, it was a societal one. Humanity had built its civilizations on a fragile balance of trust, order, and the illusion of control. This virus shattered all of that. There were no rules in a world where survival took precedence over morality. "Do you think?" Sarah's voice faltered slightly. "Do you think we caused this?" Kepler's stomach churned at the question. He wanted to deny it, to distance himself from the responsibility, but he couldn't. They had created this, hadn't they? Even if not directly, their research, their experiments had paved the way for this nightmare. "I think," Kepler began, choosing his words carefully, "we crossed lines we didn't fully understand, and now we're paying the price." "Crossed lines," Sarah repeated quietly, her gaze distant. "We played God, didn't we?" Kepler didn't respond, but the weight of her words hung in the air between them. In the beginning, their work had been about progress curing diseases, enhancing the human condition, pushing the boundaries of science for the greater good. But somewhere along the way, they had lost sight of the risks. The arrogance that came with their advancements had blinded them to the consequences. Now, the very things they had created were tearing the world apart. The door to the lab opened, and Dr. Marlowe stepped inside, his face ashen. He didn't have to say a word. The look in his eyes told Kepler everything he needed to know. "What's happened?" Kepler asked, though part of him didn't want the answer. Marlowe sighed heavily, running a hand across his face. "Another city's fallen, New Delhi." Sarah's eyes widened. "New Delhi? How fast is this spreading?" "Too fast," Marlowe said, shaking his head. "The military's losing control. People are rioting in the streets. Hospitals can't keep up with the infections. It's chaos out there. Martial law isn't enough anymore." Kepler sat down, the reality of it all sinking in further. Cities were collapsing one after the other. The virus was moving faster than they could react, faster than any containment measures they had put in place. "We're not equipped to handle this," Marlowe continued, his voice strained. "We thought we had more time, but it's everywhere now. There's no stopping it." "Has there been any progress on the cure?" Sarah asked, her tone desperate. Marlowe glanced at Kepler before shaking his head. "No. The virus is evolving too quickly. Every time we think we've got something, it adapts. We can't keep up." The lab fell silent again, the enormity of their failure pressing down on all of them. "We have to start thinking about survival," Marlowe said after a long pause. "People are going to turn on each other soon. We've already seen looting, riots. It's only going to get worse. The world's not ready for something like this." Kepler closed his eyes, the weight of the situation unbearable. He had spent his entire career working toward progress, toward a future where humanity could overcome its limitations. But now, all of that felt meaningless. They had pushed too far, and now they were watching the world burn because of it. "How do we survive this?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kepler opened his eyes and looked at her. He didn't have an answer. Survival seemed like such a distant concept now, as if it belonged to a different time, a different world. But he knew one thing for certain: survival wouldn't be pretty, it wouldn't be ethical, it wouldn't be human. Marlowe cleared his throat, his eyes heavy with guilt. "There's talk of drastic measures, quarantine camps, forced isolation. They're even discussing selective treatment based on social value." Sarah's face paled. "What? They can't do that." "They're already doing it," Marlowe replied grimly. "The government's prioritizing resources for those deemed essential. They're rationing medical supplies, food, everything. It's survival of the fittest out there." Kepler felt a cold chill run down his spine. This was the future they had created, a world where the value of a human life was measured by its utility to the system. The virus hadn't just infected bodies, it had infected the very fabric of society. The principles they had once held sacred, equality, compassion, humanity, were eroding in the face of survival. "Is that who we are now?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "Is that what we've become? A society that only saves the useful and abandons the rest?" Kepler didn't answer. He couldn't. Because deep down, he knew that in the face of extinction, morality often took a back seat. People were scared. Governments were scared. And when fear ruled, ethics became expendable. "We need to prepare ourselves," Marlowe said, his voice steady but grim. "Things are going to get worse before they get better, if they ever get better." Kepler stood up, his legs shaky, the room spinning slightly. He walked over to the window and looked out at the city below. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual bustle of life replaced by the ominous silence of a city on the brink of collapse. Martial law had turned the streets into militarized zones, but even the soldiers wouldn't be able to hold back what was coming. In the distance, a plume of smoke rose into the sky, a stark reminder of the chaos that was slowly engulfing the world. Kepler turned back to face Sarah and Marlowe, his expression unreadable. "We need to stop pretending there's a way to fix this." Marlowe raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Kepler sighed, the weight of his words settling in his chest. "There's no cure. There's no stopping the virus. We need to accept that." Sarah looked horrified. "You're giving up?" "I'm being realistic," Kepler said, his voice calm but firm. "We've crossed a line we can't uncross. This virus, it's beyond us now. All we can do is try to survive. But we need to start thinking about what survival actually means." Marlowe nodded slowly, his expression grim. "Survival at what cost?" Kepler didn't respond right away. He stared at the floor, lost in thought. Survival had always been humanity's greatest instinct. But at what point did survival override everything else? At what point did they lose their humanity in the process? He looked up at Sarah, his eyes heavy with the weight of the question. What's the point of surviving if we lose ourselves in the process? The room fell into a deep, uncomfortable silence. None of them had an answer. Outside, the world continued to unravel, and with it, the very essence of what it meant to be human. The sterile hum of the lab no longer offered comfort to anyone. It had become a place of growing tension, filled with the weight of unsaid words and widening divisions. The air was thick with unspoken fear, the kind that neither science nor logic could diffuse. As the virus continued its relentless march, a growing sense of desperation began to settle over Kepler's team like a slow, creeping fog. Kepler stood over a microscope, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the focus. Under the lens, the virus continued to mutate, its tendrils of destruction weaving deeper into the fabric of human biology. He watched it with a mix of awe and horror. What had started as a predictable pathogen had become something entirely new, an organism that seemed to learn, to adapt faster than anything they'd ever encountered. "It's changing again," Sarah's voice broke the silence. She had been observing the same mutations on her screen, her expression unreadable. "Every time we think we understand it, it shifts. It's like it knows we're trying to stop it." Kepler didn't look up from the microscope. "It's not that it knows," he replied quietly. "It's just nature, evolution." "That's just it," Sarah said, her tone sharper than before. "This isn't how evolution works. Not at this pace. Organisms don't just change like this overnight." She was right, of course. The virus was evolving at a rate that defied the natural order. Every countermeasure they developed, every potential treatment they explored, was rendered useless almost immediately. It was as if the virus was always one step ahead, as if it was toying with them. "Maybe we've underestimated it," Sarah continued, her voice softer now, tinged with uncertainty. "Maybe there's something more to this, something we're missing." Kepler finally looked up, meeting her gaze. The exhaustion in her eyes mirrored his own. "We've underestimated a lot of things," he said, his voice low. "This virus isn't just biology, it's reshaping the rules." He didn't elaborate, but the implication was clear. What they were dealing with wasn't just a viral outbreak. It was something much more complex, something that defied their understanding of science and nature, and it was winning. A loud thud echoed from across the room, breaking their moment of silence. Kepler turned to see Dr. Harris slamming his fist against the table, papers scattered around him. "This is pointless," Harris shouted, his voice hoarse. "We're wasting time chasing a cure that doesn't exist." The rest of the team froze, their eyes fixed on Harris, who was now pacing back and forth like a caged animal. His frustration was palpable, his movements erratic. He had always been the most rational, the one who kept his head down and did the work. But now, even he was unraveling. "We need to focus on survival," Harris continued, his voice rising. "The virus is unstoppable. We need to think beyond trying to cure it. We need to control it. Control it? Sarah asked, her brow furrowing. What are you suggesting? Harris stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes wild with desperation. Weaponize it. Turn it into something we can use. Sarah's expression darkened. You can't be serious. I'm dead serious, Harris shot back. We're at war with this thing, and we're losing. If we can't stop it, we need to make sure we're the ones holding the reins. Think about it, Sarah. If we can control it, we can dictate who lives and who dies. We could use it to our advantage, to ensure the survival of those who matter. That's not survival, Sarah said, her voice barely concealing her anger. That's genocide. The room fell into a heavy silence. Harris glared at her, his face flushed with frustration, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. They all knew what he was suggesting crossed a line that shouldn't even be considered. But the line was there now, and they were all staring at it. Kepler finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. We're not weaponizing the virus. Harris opened his mouth to argue, but Kepler cut him off. We're scientists. We're here to save lives, not destroy them. Harris shook his head, his expression hardening. You're living in a fantasy, Kepler. This isn't about saving lives anymore. This is about survival. Pure and simple. Kepler's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Deep down, he knew Harris wasn't entirely wrong. Survival was becoming the only thing that mattered now. But the cost of that survival was something he wasn't willing to pay. Not yet, at least. Sarah looked between the two men, her face set with determination. We need to stay focused. The virus is evolving faster than we can keep up, but that doesn't mean we give up on finding a solution. We can't just surrender. Harris let out a bitter laugh. Surrender? You still think this is something we can fix, don't you? You still think there's hope? I don't think, Sarah said quietly. I know there's more at stake here than just our survival. We're fighting for humanity, not just in the physical sense, but in the moral one. If we lose that, then we've already lost everything. Kepler listened to their exchange, his mind turning over the implications of their words. Sarah was right, but so was Harris. They were standing at a precipice, staring down into the abyss, and the choices they made in the coming days would determine the future of their species. It wasn't just about a cure anymore. It was about what kind of world they were willing to leave behind. He stood up and walked toward the far end of the lab, where the data streams on the virus's mutations continued to roll across the screens. Each new iteration of the virus brought with it new challenges, new dangers. It had begun to infect in ways they couldn't have predicted, targeting neural pathways, manipulating immune responses, finding ways to spread through contact that defied the conventional understanding of epidemiology. But what concerned Kepler most wasn't just the virus's ability to mutate. It was how humanity was beginning to mutate in response. Outside the lab, reports were coming in of strange occurrences, people who had survived infection only to exhibit unusual physiological changes. Enhanced immune systems, altered metabolism, even reports of heightened senses. It was as if the virus wasn't just killing, it was forcing humanity to evolve. It's not just the virus that's changing, Kepler said, more to himself than to anyone else. Sarah looked up from her screen. What do you mean? Kepler turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. There are survivors out there, people who should have died, but didn't. And they're different. Physically, mentally. The virus isn't just killing, it's reshaping us. Harris scoffed. You're talking about evolution? In real time? Kepler nodded slowly. Maybe that's exactly what this is. Evolution, but not in the way we expected. This virus is forcing us to adapt, whether we're ready for it or not. Sarah frowned, clearly unsettled by the idea. But what does that mean for us? For the future? Kepler didn't answer right away. He stared at the data on the screen, watching the virus mutate and evolve, realizing that humanity was now part of that process. They weren't just fighting against the virus anymore, they were being shaped by it. It means we're standing on the edge of something new, Kepler said finally, his voice quiet but steady. and we need to decide who we're going to be when we come out the other side." Harris crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. "And what if we don't come out the other side? What if this virus changes us in ways we can't control?" Kepler met his gaze. "Then we'll have to ask ourselves whether the fight was ever about control in the first place." The room fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the silence of fear or uncertainty, it was the silence of realization. The virus wasn't just a biological threat. It was a mirror, reflecting humanity's deepest flaws and strengths back at them. And in that reflection, they saw both their potential for destruction and their capacity for growth. As Kepler stood there, watching the virus continue to evolve on the screen, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of awe. Nature had a way of humbling even the most brilliant minds, reminding them that they were part of a much larger, much older system. And in that system, survival wasn't just about who was the strongest or the smartest, it was about who could adapt. But adaptation came with a cost, and Kepler knew that, whatever came next, humanity would have to face itself in ways it never had before. "Maybe we were never meant to control it," Kepler said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Maybe we were meant to be changed by it." The weight of his words hung in the air, a quiet reminder that some battles couldn't be won through force or intellect alone. Sometimes, the only way forward was to evolve whether they wanted to or not. And in that evolution, humanity would either find its salvation or its end. The lab had grown quieter over the past few days. A kind of eerie stillness, like the calm before a storm, hung in the air. The tension no longer erupted in sharp words or arguments. It simmered beneath the surface, manifesting instead in the weariness on everyone's faces, the heavy silence that punctuated every glance exchanged between colleagues. Kepler found himself standing alone at the window, watching as the first light of dawn broke through the horizon. Outside, the world was falling apart. Governments, institutions, even the concept of civilization seemed to be unraveling. The virus's relentless spread had pushed humanity to its breaking point, forcing people to retreat into isolated pockets, some forming desperate alliances to find a cure, others descending into chaos, surrendering to the inevitable. But Kepler's thoughts were elsewhere. The changes they had begun observing in survivors haunted him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the virus was not merely an agent of destruction. It was something more, a catalyst for a fundamental shift in the human species. Behind him, the lab buzzed softly with data streaming in, but no one spoke. They had long since passed the point where words could offer comfort or clarity. Sarah sat hunched over her console, eyes fixed on the screen, her fingers moving in slow, methodical patterns. Harris remained in the corner, isolated from the group, his demeanor increasingly cold and detached. Kepler knew they were all waiting for something, though none of them would admit it aloud. Waiting for the next mutation, the next piece of data that would confirm their worst fears, or perhaps offer the smallest sliver of hope. But the waiting was unbearable, and the deeper truth they were all reluctant to face was that humanity's future was no longer in their hands. The door hissed open behind him, and Kepler turned to see Elias entering the room, his face pale and drawn. Elias had always been the most optimistic of them, the one who believed there was still something worth saving. But even his optimism had begun to fade in recent days. He moved slowly now, his usual energy gone, replaced by a heavy, weary silence. "Elias," Kepler greeted, his voice low. "You've been out longer than usual." Elias gave a small nod and leaned against the edge of the table, his eyes distant. "There's no point in staying out there anymore," he replied softly. "It's all falling apart." Kepler could tell there was more on Elias's mind, something weighing heavily on him, but he didn't press. Instead, he simply waited, allowing the silence to do its work. He had learned long ago that some truths could only be spoken in their own time. Elias finally looked up, his eyes tired and red-rimmed. "We lost more people today," he said quietly. His voice faltered, and he looked away, clenching his jaw. "People who mattered." Kepler felt the weight of those words. They had all lost people, colleagues, friends, loved ones, but for Elias, this loss had been different. It was personal in a way that cut deeper than the rest of them could understand. "I'm sorry," Kepler said, though the words felt hollow. They all knew that apologies meant nothing in the face of this kind of devastation. Elias exhaled slowly, his gaze falling to the floor. "I keep thinking about what you said, Kepler, about the virus, about how it's changing us. And I can't stop wondering, maybe this is our fault. Maybe we brought this on ourselves." Kepler frowned, his eyes narrowing slightly. "How do you mean?" Elias pushed away from the table and began to pace, his hands moving restlessly as if trying to grasp something just beyond his reach. "Think about it," he said, his voice rising. "For centuries, we've tampered with everything. Nature, biology, the very fabric of life itself. We've pushed the boundaries of science without ever considering the consequences. We've created things we can't control. And now?" He gestured toward the data streams flashing across the monitors. "Now the universe is pushing back." Kepler considered Elias's words in silence. It wasn't a new thought. He had entertained similar ideas in the quiet of the night, alone with his doubts. But hearing Elias' voice, it so plainly brought a sense of clarity that was both unsettling and strangely inevitable. "Are you suggesting this is some kind of punishment?" Sarah asked, looking up from her console, her expression one of disbelief. "That this virus is... what? Retribution for our hubris?" "I don't know," Elias replied, his voice trembling with the weight of his uncertainty. "But what if evolution isn't just about survival of the fittest? What if it's about balance? What if we've been upsetting that balance for too long, and now the universe is correcting itself?" Kepler watched as the room fell into an uneasy silence. There was something raw in Elias's words, something that resonated on a deeper level than the usual scientific discussions. It was an existential question, one that forced them to confront not just the virus, but their own role in the greater order of things. "That's a dangerous line of thought," Harris muttered from his corner, his voice flat and emotionless. "You start thinking like that, and you'll find yourself justifying anything, blaming humanity for every catastrophe, every disaster." Elias stopped pacing, turning to face Harris. "I'm not blaming humanity," he said quietly. "I'm just asking whether we've been too blind to see the consequences of our actions. We've spent centuries manipulating life, creating new technologies, building systems that are supposed to make our lives easier, safer. But at what cost? Maybe we've reached the point where the universe is saying enough." Kepler glanced at Harris, who scoffed but said nothing more. Harris had always been a pragmatist, uninterested in philosophical debates. To him, the virus was just another problem to solve or control. But for Elias, this was personal. It was about more than just the virus. It was about what humanity had become. "You think we've reached some kind of evolutionary limit?" Kepler asked, his voice steady, though the question itself felt heavy with implication. Elias ran a hand through his hair, his expression conflicted. "Maybe, or maybe we're at a crossroads. Either we evolve, learn to adapt in ways we never imagined, or we face extinction. The virus isn't just a killer, it's a mirror, showing us who we are, what we've done." Kepler stared at Elias, feeling the weight of his words settle over the room like a thick blanket. The virus was forcing them to confront truths they had long avoided, forcing them to question not just their survival, but their very existence. "Then what do we do?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice breaking the silence. "If this is evolution, or whatever you want to call it, what do we do?" Elias didn't answer right away. He turned back toward the window, his gaze distant once again. "I don't know," he admitted softly. "I just know that we can't keep fighting this like it's something we can control. We can't weaponize it. We can't cure it the way we've cured other diseases. It's changing us, and we have to figure out whether we're willing to change with it." Kepler felt a shiver run down his spine. The idea that humanity was being reshaped by this virus, forced to evolve in ways they hadn't anticipated, was terrifying. But it was also liberating, in a strange way. The virus was stripping away the illusions they had built around themselves, the illusion of control, the illusion of dominance over nature. It was reminding them that they were, after all, just another species in a vast, uncaring universe. Harris, however, wasn't convinced. "This is ridiculous," he said, standing up from his corner and crossing the room. "You're all sitting around talking like philosophers while the world burns. We need solutions, not existential debates. We need to act, not sit here contemplating the meaning of life." Elias turned to face him, his expression calm but resolute. "And what do you propose, Harris? What's your solution? Weaponize the virus, as you suggested? Turn it into something that will ensure our survival at the expense of everyone else?" Harris glared at him, his jaw tight. "If that's what it takes, then yes, survival comes first." Elias shook his head, a sad smile playing on his lips. "Survival without humanity isn't survival. It's just prolonging the inevitable." The tension between the two men was palpable, but Kepler stepped forward, raising a hand to diffuse it. "We need to remember why we're here," he said quietly, his voice steady. "We came here to find a way to save lives. That's still our goal, even if the rules have changed. We can't afford to lose sight of that." Harris clenched his fists, but after a long moment, he stepped back, unwilling to continue the argument. Elias sighed and turned back to the window, watching the light fade from the sky as the sun set beyond the horizon. "Maybe the universe doesn't allow limits to the manipulation of life," he said softly. "Maybe it's showing us that we've reached the limits of our ambition, and now we have to decide whether we can live within those limits or whether we'll destroy ourselves trying to surpass them." Kepler stood in silence, his gaze following Elias's out the window. The city beyond the lab was a shadow of what it had once been, and yet, in that darkness, there was something else. A glimmer of light, perhaps, a possibility, faint as it might be. As the night closed in, he couldn't help but wonder, had humanity, in its relentless pursuit of progress, lost sight of its place in the universe? Had they, in their ambition, forgotten the delicate balance that sustained life? And if so, could they find their way back before it was too late? Kepler hadn't moved from the window since their last conversation. The sun had disappeared hours ago, replaced by the endless gloom that now defined the world outside. He could see the distant ruins of the city, bathed in the dim glow of emergency lights, their faint flickers barely perceptible through the dense fog. It was hard to tell where the city ended and the rest of the world began. Everything felt disconnected, as if they were living in a separate reality, isolated from the crumbling remnants of civilization. The lab behind him hummed with activity, though the mood had shifted. Elias's words lingered in the air, stirring something deep within the group, though no one dared voice it openly. The concept of survival, once so simple and instinctual, had become something more, something tainted by doubt and fear. Kepler's thoughts, though heavy, were interrupted by the familiar sound of the door hissing open. He didn't need to turn to know who had entered. Elias's presence was almost palpable now, the air thickening with the gravity of what he was about to say. "Kepler," Elias began, his voice unusually calm, almost resigned. "We found something." Kepler turned slowly, locking eyes with Elias. There was a quiet intensity in his gaze, a mixture of exhaustion and determination that hadn't been there before. He wasn't alone. Sarah stood beside him, her expression cautious but resolute. Harris lingered in the background, arms crossed, his face set in a hard line. "What is it?" Kepler asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew. The team had been pushing boundaries for weeks, exploring every avenue, no matter how dangerous or ethically dubious. Desperation had a way of erasing lines that once seemed immutable. Elias took a step forward, holding a small tablet in his hands. "We've isolated a sequence in the virus, something we didn't see before. It's not just attacking human cells, it's rewriting them." Kepler's stomach tightened. "Rewriting? In what way?" Sarah answered before Elias could. "It's altering the DNA, specifically the genes responsible for immune response. It's why the virus is so effective. Our bodies aren't just fighting it, they're being reprogrammed to accept it." Kepler felt the weight of her words, but he couldn't fully grasp the implications. "So what does this mean for us?" Is there a way to stop it? Elias exchanged a glance with Sarah before responding. We think there might be, he said cautiously, but it's complicated. Complicated how? Harris's voice cut through the tension, his impatience clear. Elias sighed, tapping the tablet lightly as if the weight of the information it held was almost too much to bear. We've run simulations, tested possible solutions. The only viable option we've found is genetic modification. Kepler's heart skipped a beat. The phrase hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Genetic modification had always been a subject of debate, even before the virus. Now, with the world on the brink of collapse, it felt like the final, desperate gambit. You're talking about altering human DNA, Kepler said slowly, the reality of the situation sinking in. Not just treating the symptoms, but fundamentally changing who we are. Elias nodded, his expression grim. Yes, we can modify the genes that the virus targets, make them resistant. It's not a cure, not in the traditional sense, but it would make us immune to the virus, at least in theory. In theory, Harris scoffed. That's all we have now, more theories. What about the actual risks? We're talking about playing with the very code of life here. Sarah stepped forward, her voice measured but firm. We know the risks, Harris, but we're out of options. The virus is spreading faster than we can contain it. People are dying by the millions. If we don't act now, there won't be anyone left to save. Harris shook his head, his frustration palpable. And what happens when we start rewriting our own DNA? Do we even know what kind of side effects we're talking about? We could create something worse than the virus itself. Elias looked at Kepler, his eyes pleading for understanding. We don't have time to debate this, Kepler. The simulations show that genetic modification is the only solution that has a chance of working. It's not perfect, and yes, there are risks. But if we do nothing, the human race is finished. Kepler stood in silence, the weight of their decision pressing down on him. He glanced at Sarah, then Harris, feeling the tension between them. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about what kind of future they were willing to create and whether they could live with the consequences of their actions. Is this really the only way? Kepler asked quietly, more to himself than anyone else. He had never been comfortable with the idea of genetic modification, even in the best of times. It felt like crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Elias nodded solemnly. It's the only way we've found. We can start with small-scale trials, test the modifications on volunteers, but we have to move quickly. Every day we wait, more people die. The room fell silent again, the enormity of their choice hanging over them like a storm cloud. Kepler could feel the eyes of his team on him, waiting for his decision. He was the one who had brought them together, the one who had led them through this crisis. But now, standing on the precipice of something that could change the course of human history, he wasn't sure he was ready to make the call. We'll need to inform the others, Kepler said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside him. We can't make this decision alone. Elias nodded in agreement. We'll hold a meeting. Let everyone voice their concerns, but we have to make it clear time is running out. As the group dispersed to prepare for the meeting, Kepler remained at the window, his mind racing. The idea of genetic modification wasn't just a scientific challenge, it was a moral one. They were tampering with the very essence of what it meant to be human. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. The meeting took place in one of the larger rooms adjacent to the lab, a cold, sterile space that seemed ill-suited to the gravity of the discussion at hand. Word had spread quickly through the underground facility, and it wasn't long before the room was filled with the remaining members of their team, researchers, medical staff, technicians, all gathered to hear what Kepler and Elias had to say. Elias stood at the front, addressing the group with a calm yet urgent tone. He explained the breakthrough they had discovered, the potential for genetic modification to make humans resistant to the virus. As he spoke, Kepler watched the faces of those around him, seeing the mixture of hope and fear reflected in their eyes. When Elias finished, the room erupted in questions. How can we be sure it'll work? What about the long-term effects? Are we creating a new disease? Do we even have the right to make this kind of decision? Kepler listened in silence, feeling the weight of each question. These were the same doubts that had plagued him since Elias first mentioned genetic modification. But now, standing before his team, he realized that there were no easy answers. They were facing an impossible situation, one that demanded impossible choices. "We've run the simulations," Sarah interjected, her voice cutting through the noise. "The data is clear. Genetic modification is our best shot. It's not perfect, but it's better than waiting for a miracle that isn't coming." "But at what cost?" one of the researchers asked, his voice trembling with emotion. "We're talking about altering human DNA, changing who we are. Can we really justify that, even in the face of extinction?" Kepler stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "I understand the fear. I share it. But we have to ask ourselves, what is the alternative? Do we let the virus run its course, wipe out the human race, and hope that something else rises in our place? Or do we take control of our own destiny, even if it means making sacrifices we never thought we'd have to make?" The room fell silent again, the enormity of Kepler's words sinking in. This was more than a scientific decision. It was a question of survival, of identity, of what it meant to be human. "We're not making this decision lightly," Elias added, his voice soft but resolute. "We'll start with volunteers. We'll test the modifications carefully, monitor every step. But we have to act, and we have to act now." Harris, who had remained silent for most of the meeting, finally spoke up. "And if we fail? If this goes wrong, we're not just risking our lives. We're risking the future of the entire species." Kepler met Harris's gaze, understanding the gravity of his words. "If we do nothing, the species has no future." For a moment, no one spoke. The room was filled with the quiet hum of the machines, the sound of anxious breaths, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on them all. "I'll volunteer," a voice said from the back of the room. All eyes turned to the speaker, one of the junior researchers, a young woman named Leela. She stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "If this is our best chance, then I'll take it." Her words seemed to break the tension in the room. Slowly, others began to nod, murmuring their agreement. The fear was still there, but so was the resolve. They all knew the risks, but in the face of extinction, they were willing to take them. As the meeting adjourned, Kepler found himself once again standing at the window, looking out at the ruined world beyond. The night had grown darker, the distant lights flickering like dying embers. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something profound, something that would change them all, for better or for worse. Was this the right path? Was survival worth the cost of altering what it meant to be human? Kepler didn't have the answers, but as the shadows deepened around him, he realized that the question itself might be the only thing left that still mattered. Elias stared down at the glowing display of genetic sequences, his mind detached from the constant hum of the machinery surrounding him. Rows upon rows of genetic markers scrolled past on the screen, each a tiny fragment of what made a human. Every pixel represented centuries of evolution, the result of millions of adaptations, successes, and failures across lifetimes. Yet here they were, attempting to unravel and manipulate this complex web in a matter of days. The team had grown quiet. Conversations that once sparked with a thrill of discovery had dulled into silent contemplation, the weight of their work pressing down on them all. Elias didn't blame them. There was nothing easy about altering the very foundation of human life. The first experiments had yielded nothing more than frustration. DNA strands unraveling where they shouldn't, immune systems reacting violently to even the smallest changes. But they couldn't afford to stop. Time, already a scarce commodity, was slipping through their fingers. Behind him, the lab's atmosphere pulsed with an urgency it hadn't before. The air felt thicker, not just from the weight of the task, but from the silent realization hanging over each of them. They were changing something that could never be undone. Gene after gene was being carefully spliced, tested, and re-engineered to resist the virus. What was once considered impossible, rewriting the code of life, was now being tackled as the only viable path to survival. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very pursuit of dominance over nature had brought them here. Yet here they were again, trying to bend nature to their will. Elias ran a hand through his hair, noticing the thinning patches. He'd aged more in these last months than in the past decade. It wasn't just the late nights or the constant pressure. The guilt gnawed at him. How far was too far? The question whispered through his mind, even as his hands continued their work, unrelenting. He glanced at the far corner of the lab where Dr. Sato was hunched over his own station. The younger man had been one of the first to argue for restraint, for caution. Now, Sato's eyes were hollow, his protests dulled by the rising numbers of the dead. The process itself was grueling. Elias often felt as though he were dissecting the very soul of humanity with each new manipulation. They were reprogramming people at the most fundamental level. DNA wasn't just a collection of chemicals, it was memory, history, and identity woven into biological form. To tamper with it felt like rewriting the core of what made them human. Every decision weighed on him, pulling him deeper into isolation. It wasn't just the fear of failure, but the moral implications that began to creep into every thought. Was he saving humanity, or was he ushering in something else entirely? As Elias prepared another batch for testing, the lab doors slid open with a hiss. Sarah walked in, her usual steady presence a small anchor in the swirling storm of uncertainty. She glanced at the screen, then at Elias, before sitting beside him. Her silence spoke volumes. "Do you think this will work?" she finally asked, her voice softer than usual. Elias didn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the shifting code in front of him. "It has to. We're running out of time." "But is it worth the cost?" Her words were a quiet challenge, more philosophical than scientific. He closed his eyes briefly, a surge of weariness washing over him. "What choice do we have, Sarah? Every day we lose more lives. If we can stop this, if we can rewrite what the virus is doing to us, don't we have an obligation to try?" "I'm not talking about the virus." She leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "I'm talking about us. The cure is changing us too. What does it mean if we succeed? What do we become?" For a moment, the room seemed to freeze, the weight of her question hanging in the air. Elias had avoided thinking about it in such direct terms. His thoughts were always focused on the immediate survival, the next breakthrough. But she was right. The cure wasn't just a fix. It was a transformation. They were no longer simply fighting a virus, they were reshaping themselves in the process. Sato joined them at the table, wiping sweat from his brow. His voice was quiet, but resolute. "This isn't evolution. This is control. We're stepping beyond what nature intended. How long before we're not the same species anymore?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Elias didn't have an answer, at least not one that could ease the doubts swimming in his mind. They were playing God, tampering with the essence of life itself. Each new gene spliced, each resistance engineered into the human body, felt like a step toward an unknown future. "You're both seeing this the wrong way," another voice interjected. Dr. Lennox, the head of virology, stood at the entrance, her expression hard and unyielding. "We're not losing our humanity, we're saving it. Evolution isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we've always influenced. We've been doing it for millennia: selective breeding, medicine, technology. This is just the next step." "But it's not natural," Sato muttered. "We're choosing who lives and who evolves." Lennox stepped forward, her gaze unflinching. "We are nature. Humanity's survival instinct is as natural as the virus itself. If we don't take control, we'll die." The room fell into a tense quiet once again. Each person was wrestling with their own version of the future. The lab, once a place of hope and discovery, had become a battlefield of ideologies. What were they really saving, and at what cost? Elias stared at the data before him, feeling the weight of responsibility heavier than ever. He had been the one to push for this path. In the beginning, it seemed clear they would stop the virus. They would find a way to preserve life. But now, with each experiment, each alteration, the lines blurred. Were they still trying to save humanity, or were they creating something new, something fundamentally different? His thoughts drifted back to the earliest days of the pandemic, when the virus was first identified. It had been so simple: then find the source, develop a vaccine, stop the spread. But nature, as always, proved unpredictable. The virus had adapted, evolved, and now, so had they? But was this evolution or a forced mutation? And if they were forcing their own evolution, what did that mean for the future? Could humanity remain intact, or would they lose themselves in the process? Elias leaned back in his chair, feeling the exhaustion settle deep into his bones. The answers eluded him. All he had were more questions. But one thing was clear: they had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. "We're not just curing a disease," he said quietly, almost to himself. "We're redefining what it means to be human." Sarah nodded, her expression grim. "And once we do that, there's no going back." The air in the lab felt heavier than before, as if the very weight of their decisions was pressing down on them. Elias stood and moved toward the window, looking out over the crumbling remains of the city. Once, humanity had built towering monuments to its own greatness, reaching ever higher, defying the natural order. Now, those same monuments lay in ruins, a stark reminder of how fragile their existence truly was. Outside, the world was still fighting to survive, but inside the lab, they were no longer just fighting the virus. They were fighting for the soul of humanity itself. Elias turned away from the window, the shadows of the future stretching long before him. "Maybe," he whispered, "we were never meant to control it all." Elias stood at the edge of the laboratory, staring out into the narrow, sterile hallway beyond the thick glass doors. His reflection hovered in the transparent surface. Overlaid on the sterile world, he had come to inhabit a place of constant light, ceaseless questions, and silent turmoil. Behind him, the hum of machines continued, almost indifferent to the events they had set in motion. The air, thick with sterilizers, felt claustrophobic, though the lab's walls were lined with the finest tech humanity had left to offer. But that was just it, wasn't it? What was left of humanity? The words twisted in his mind, gnawing at the uneasy edges of his thoughts. What had they done? The question lurked under every conversation, every breakthrough, every new patient that emerged from the process they had devised. These weren't mere survivors anymore. They were something else. Elias shifted his gaze, watching as one of the newly modified humans was led through the hallway, escorted by armed guards, another reminder of the division that now defined society. The man, who had once been a middle-aged father of two before the virus had ravaged his body, now walked with a strange calm, his expression serene, almost otherworldly. There were no outward signs of his transformation, no obvious markers of his genetic reprogramming, but there was something in his eyes that Elias couldn't quite place. A distance, perhaps? Or maybe it was detachment. Whatever it was, it unsettled him. The cure had worked, if you could call it that. The virus, once unstoppable, had been halted in these subjects. Their bodies, fortified at a genetic level, now resisted the infection. They were immune to it, just as Elias had hoped. But in the process, something fundamental had shifted. He couldn't pinpoint it, not yet. But the questions weighed heavier each day. What had they created? These new beings were no longer merely human. They were something else, an intersection between biology and technology, nature and artificial manipulation. Elias turned away from the glass, returning to his workstation, where another set of genetic readouts blinked on the screen. The data told a cold story, success. But the emotions roiling within him, and within society, told a much different tale. The first few to be released from quarantine were hailed as miracles. Families, once resigned to burying their loved ones, found them returned alive, whole, and untouched by the virus. The headlines spoke of salvation, of humanity's triumph over its greatest enemy. The modified humans were paraded as the pinnacle of human ingenuity, the final, irrefutable proof that science had defeated death itself. But that victory came with a price. Not everyone saw the cured as saviors. For every voice praising them, there was another raised in suspicion, in anger. Whispers of unnatural creation spread like wildfire. These aren't people anymore. There's something else. We've lost control. Fear simmered beneath the surface, and Elias could feel it in every conversation he had, in every report from the field. He sat across from Sarah later that day, their discussion turning to the growing unrest. She had just returned from a council meeting with the political leaders overseeing the distribution of the cure. "The public is divided," she said, her voice heavy with fatigue. "Some are demanding the cure be made mandatory for everyone. Others want it banned entirely. They're calling the modified abominations now." Elias leaned back, the tension in his muscles refusing to release. "It was inevitable. No one likes to face what we've done." "It's not about facing it, Elias," Sarah replied, her gaze sharp. "It's about control. They're afraid we've crossed a line we can't uncross. They want someone to blame for it." He ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble on his chin. "And they've decided we're the ones." Sarah didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "What did we think was going to happen? That people would just accept this new reality without question?" Elias stared at her, unsure of how to respond. They hadn't discussed it in those terms before. There had been no time to think about the social ramifications of the cure. Everything had been about survival, stopping the virus, preserving life. But now that the immediate threat had been neutralized, the broader implications were impossible to ignore. "What's happening outside?" he asked quietly. "Protests. Some violent, mostly peaceful for now. People are scared, Elias. They don't trust what they don't understand." He stood up, pacing the small room. "But they have to see that this is the only way. We've saved lives, Sarah. We've saved humanity." Sarah's eyes followed him, a shadow of doubt in her expression. "But have we? Or have we just remade it into something unrecognizable?" Her question hung between them, unanswered. Later that week, Elias found himself in the same sterile interview room where he had been meeting the modified subjects since the program's inception. Today, it was Isaac, one of the first to undergo the genetic reprogramming. He sat across from Elias, his hands resting on the metal table. Isaac had been a schoolteacher before the virus had ravaged his body. His wife had died during the initial wave of the pandemic, leaving him with 2 young children. He had volunteered for the program not out of desperation, but out of hope that he could survive for his children. Now, Isaac's face was calm, almost serene, as Elias began the usual battery of questions. "How are you feeling?" Elias asked, his voice neutral. "Good," Isaac replied, his tone measured, almost robotic. "Better than before." "Any lingering side effects? Fatigue? Pain?" "No." The conversation followed its typical script: questions, answers, data collection. But something felt off. Isaac's responses were too quick, too clean. Elias studied him for a moment, the same unsettling feeling creeping into his mind. "Isaac, do you feel any different? I mean, other than physically?" Isaac paused for a moment, his eyes flickering with something Elias couldn't quite decipher. "I feel clearer. My thoughts, it's like there's less noise." "Less noise?" Isaac nodded. "Before, there was always this constant background of emotions: fear, anxiety, grief. Now it's quieter. I still remember everything. I still feel things, but it's not overwhelming anymore. It's like I can control it better." Elias's stomach twisted. This wasn't the first time he had heard something like this from the modified. They all described it differently, but the underlying message was the same. Something in them had changed. Their emotional responses, once raw and human, had been muted, streamlined, controlled. He scribbled a note on his tablet, then set it aside. "And your children? How are they adjusting to your return?" "They're happy to have me back," Isaac said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "They were scared at first, but they're adjusting." "Do they notice any differences in you?" Isaac hesitated. "Maybe. They don't say anything, but I can see it in their eyes. They're watching me, like they're waiting for something." Elias's throat tightened. He leaned forward, his voice low. "And what do you think they're waiting for?" Isaac's smile faded. He looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the grooves in the table. I don't know. Maybe they're waiting to see if I'm still me. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. He had been grappling with that very question for weeks now. Were these people still the same, or had they become something else entirely? The guilt of creation. After Isaac left, Elias returned to his office, where the silence felt even more oppressive than usual. He sat at his desk, his eyes drifting to the photograph on the corner, an old picture of him and his wife, taken years before the world had changed, before the virus, before the cure. She had been the first to tell him not to play God. It had been a casual conversation, years ago, over dinner. He couldn't even remember what had prompted the remark, but her words echoed in his mind now, louder than ever. You're not a god, Elias. Don't try to be one. But that's exactly what he had done. He had taken control of life and death, remade human beings in a way that defied nature's plan, and now the consequences were staring him in the face. He had thought he could save humanity, that he could outsmart the virus, outsmart nature itself. But now he wasn't sure if he had saved anyone at all. Maybe he had just traded one kind of death for another. The modified humans were alive, yes. They were immune to the virus, yes, but at what cost? Was life still life if it had been engineered, controlled, stripped of its natural course? And what did it mean for the future? If they could rewrite the genetic code of humanity, where did it end? Elias closed his eyes, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. What have I done? He had set out to save humanity, but now he wasn't sure if humanity could survive what he had created. The protests outside were growing louder by the day, the divide between the modified and the unmodified widening with each passing moment. Society was fracturing, and Elias could feel the cracks deepening beneath his feet. The modified were no longer just survivors, they were symbols, representations of the chasm between science and nature, between life and death. In the silence of his office, Elias wondered if he had become the very thing he had sworn to avoid: a creator without wisdom, a god without foresight. And the question that haunted him most was whether humanity could ever return from the path he had set them on. Elias stood motionless in his office, the ambient hum of the air system being the only sound that filled the sterile room. His thoughts, however, were far from calm, swirling in a disorienting storm. What once felt like a calculated, moral decision now seemed like an act of arrogance, a dangerous miscalculation with consequences that reached beyond what any of them had anticipated. They had tampered with the very fabric of human life, and the seams were starting to unravel. He glanced at the photo of his wife again, the one that had become his silent witness to the unthinkable. A strange chill washed over him. You're not a god, Elias. Don't try to be one. The words were louder now, as though they had been injected with more weight with every passing day, with every modified human who left the lab and entered society, and with every report of the consequences that followed. The philosophical debate outside his door was raging, but Elias could feel the tension mounting inside himself too. His body felt heavy with the weight of guilt, not because of the scientific achievement, but because of its fallout, because of the lives it had changed, warped even. He had wanted to save humanity, but in the process, he had disrupted something essential. The lines between right and wrong, natural and unnatural, were now blurred beyond recognition. There was a knock at the door. Sarah stepped in, her face drawn, betraying the exhaustion that came with being on the front lines of both the science and the moral battle. Her eyes met Elias's, and the weight of unspoken truths hung between them. "You've seen the latest reports?" Sarah asked, her voice low, carefully measured. She placed a tablet on the table between them, though Elias knew he didn't need to read it. The contents would be predictable, more of the same troubling signs, strange, subtle behavioral changes, emotional flattening, and, more troubling, an increasing sense of alienation from the rest of the unmodified population. Elias nodded slowly. "I've seen them." She took a seat, and for a long moment they sat in silence. Words felt useless, but avoiding the conversation wouldn't stop the world outside from crumbling. "The council is asking for more control measures," Sarah finally said. They want tighter monitoring of the modified. They want mandatory psychological screenings, mandatory reintegration programs, and quarantines. Elias finished her sentence, his voice heavy with frustration. Sarah's lips tightened into a thin line. Yes, they're afraid, Elias. People are starting to see the modified as dangerous. Dangerous? Elias stood abruptly, his hand clenched around the back of his chair. We cured them. We gave them a second chance at life. And now they're being treated like lab experiments gone wrong. Sarah's gaze softened, though her voice remained firm. It's more complicated than that. You know it is. Elias turned toward the window, his reflection faint against the backdrop of the facility's cold, white lights. He knew. He had known it for weeks now, though admitting it felt like surrendering to a truth he wasn't ready to face. There were no easy solutions here. There never had been. We didn't see this coming, he murmured, more to himself than to Sarah. We were so focused on the virus that we never thought about what would come after. We didn't have time to think about it. The virus was wiping us out, Elias. There wasn't a choice. Elias closed his eyes, his fingers tracing the windowsill. But now there is, and we have to live with the consequences. In the days that followed, Elias found himself more and more estranged from his own work. Each morning, he entered the lab with a sense of growing detachment, as though the very air had become hostile. He went through the motions, reviewing data, speaking with colleagues, but the conversations felt empty, mechanical. The energy, the excitement that had once driven him to push the limits of science, had been replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. The reports from the outside world were growing more alarming. Incidents of violence between the modified and unmodified were being reported with increasing frequency. Most of them started as minor altercations, misunderstandings that escalated quickly, but it was clear that the gap between the two groups was widening. Elias sat in yet another briefing, his colleagues arguing over the best course of action, but his mind was elsewhere. He had never wanted this. He had envisioned a future where humanity was saved, where they had triumphed over death itself. But instead, they were on the brink of tearing themselves apart. Elias. The voice broke through his thoughts, and he looked up to find Dr. Ashford, one of the senior researchers, staring at him from across the table. His expression was unreadable. "You've been quiet," Ashford remarked. "What's your take on all of this?" Elias hesitated, glancing around the room. The others were watching him now, waiting for his response. He swallowed the lump in his throat. "We need to be careful," he said slowly. "We're dealing with more than just biology now. This isn't just about curing a virus anymore, it's about how we define humanity." Dr. Ashford raised an eyebrow. "And what does that mean, exactly? Are you suggesting we stop distributing the cure? That we just let the virus run its course?" "No," Elias said quickly. "I'm not saying we abandon the cure. But we can't ignore the consequences. We've altered people in ways we don't fully understand yet, and we need to take responsibility for that." Ashford leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "So what's your solution? More monitoring? More restrictions?" Elias shook his head. "I don't know. But we need to stop thinking about this in purely scientific terms. There are moral and philosophical implications here, and we can't afford to ignore them." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. For a moment, no one spoke, and Elias could feel the weight of their collective uncertainty pressing down on him. These were scientists, people trained to think in terms of data and facts, not philosophy or ethics. But the questions they were facing now went beyond anything that could be solved with a microscope or a lab test. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "We're not gods," she said quietly, echoing Elias's own thoughts. "We can't pretend that we are. We need to tread carefully, or we risk losing everything." That night, Elias found himself unable to sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring into the darkness, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quiet. The protests were growing louder outside the lab, the unmodified demanding that the modified be contained, monitored, controlled. The council was debating new regulations that would limit the rights of the modified. and Elias knew that it was only a matter of time before the situation boiled over. He thought about Isaac, the former schoolteacher who had volunteered for the cure to save his children. Isaac had been one of the early successes, a model case. But now, even Isaac was different. His once gentle demeanor had become cold, distant. The changes were subtle, but they were there. Elias stood up, pacing the room. What have I done? He had wanted to save humanity, but instead, he had created a new kind of division, one that went deeper than politics or ideology. It was a division at the very core of what it meant to be human. Suddenly, his phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling him from his thoughts. He grabbed it, expecting another update from the lab, but the message that flashed on the screen made his heart stop. Riots. The modified are fighting back. By the time Elias reached the lab, the situation had spiraled out of control. A group of modified individuals had clashed with security forces outside one of the quarantine centers, and the violence had escalated quickly. Windows were shattered, vehicles overturned, and smoke filled the air as fires raged in the distance. The modified were no longer passive subjects, they were angry, and they were fighting for their survival. Elias watched the scene unfold from the security room, his stomach churning. He had never wanted this. He had never imagined that his work would lead to violence, to bloodshed. "They feel trapped," Sarah said, standing beside him. "They're being treated like criminals, and they're lashing out." Elias ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "What do they expect us to do? We're trying to help them." "But they don't see it that way anymore," Sarah replied. "To them, we're the ones who did this to them. We turned them into something they don't understand, and now we're trying to control them." Elias clenched his fists, frustration boiling inside him. "I never wanted this," he whispered. Sarah looked at him, her expression softening. "I know, but it doesn't matter what you wanted. This is where we are now, and we have to find a way to fix it." He stared at the chaos outside, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The modified were fighting for their right to exist, to be treated as equals. But the unmodified were terrified of what they represented, an unnatural, engineered future that they couldn't comprehend. The philosophical divide was no longer just a debate in the council chambers or in the lab. It was spilling into the streets, into people's homes, into the very fabric of society. And Elias knew that the question of what it meant to be human had never been more urgent. "We have to find a way to bridge the gap," Elias said quietly, "before it's too late." But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure if he believed them. Elias stood before the monitors in the dim light of his office, watching the live feeds from the streets below. The footage was grim. Riot police clashed with crowds of both modified and unmodified, their faces twisted in anger, desperation, fear. Smoke hung over the city, and fires burned in the distance. What had started as protests had escalated into something far worse. Society itself was splitting apart at the seams. He felt the weight of it all pressing down on him, a burden that seemed to grow heavier by the minute. The lab, once a place of hope and progress, now felt like a prison. Outside, people were fighting for their lives, some for freedom, others for control, but none of them truly understood the consequences of what they were fighting for. The council had issued new mandates overnight. Curfews were in place, and checkpoints had been set up to separate the modified from the unmodified. Reports of violence were increasing, and the first deaths had already been confirmed. The world was on the brink of collapse, and Elias knew that much of it was his doing. He had tried to play God, and now he was reaping the consequences. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Sarah, her voice tense. "Elias, the council is asking for your decision." Elias didn't respond immediately. He knew what she was asking, and he knew what his answer should be. But every part of him resisted. They wanted him to authorize the next phase: full containment of the modified, mandatory identification, and round-the-clock surveillance. The council believed it was the only way to prevent the chaos from spreading further, but Elias saw it for what it was: the beginning of a new kind of control, one that would only deepen the divide. He had never wanted this. His goal had always been to save humanity from the brink of extinction, to give them a future. But now that future was looking more and more like a nightmare. The modified were no longer seen as saviors, they were seen as threats, monsters created by men like him. Elias? Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts again. I need more time, he said quietly. We don't have time, Sarah replied, her frustration evident. If we don't act now, the situation will spiral completely out of control. He knew she was right, but that didn't make the decision any easier. Let me think. He ended the call before she could respond, turning his gaze back to the monitors. The image of Isaac flashed across one of the screens, a face he had once known well, now twisted into something unrecognizable. Isaac had been one of the first to receive the cure, and Elias had watched with pride as the man's body healed, his strength returning. But that strength had come at a cost. Isaac was different now, colder, more distant. He no longer seemed to feel the same emotions, the same empathy that had once defined him. It wasn't just Isaac. Reports were flooding in from across the globe. The modified were changing in ways no one had predicted. Subtle at first differences in their emotional responses, in their interactions with others, but now it was becoming clear that something fundamental had shifted. They weren't human in the same way anymore. Elias sat heavily in his chair, his mind racing. He had spent years pushing the boundaries of science, but he had never stopped to consider what it meant to cross the line. What had he created? Were they still human, or had he pushed them into something else, something beyond? A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Sarah stepped in, her face drawn and pale. She didn't speak immediately, instead taking a seat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. They're waiting for your answer, she said finally. Elias met her gaze, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the decision hung between them like a physical thing. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the toll that all of this had taken on her as well. What if we're wrong? He asked quietly. Sarah frowned. What do you mean? What if everything we've done, the cure, the modifications, what if we've made a mistake? What if we've pushed humanity in the wrong direction? She didn't answer right away, her brow furrowing as she considered his words. We didn't have a choice, Elias. The virus was killing us. We had to act. I know, he said softly, but look at what we've done. We've created a division that can't be undone. The modified, they're not like us anymore. They don't feel the same way. They don't think the same way. We've changed them in ways we never expected. Sarah's gaze hardened. You're not suggesting we should have let the virus wipe us out, are you? No, Elias said quickly, but maybe we should have been more careful. Maybe we should have thought more about what we were doing before we started playing with people's lives. Sarah leaned forward, her voice sharp. We didn't have time to think about that, Elias. People were dying. We had to do something. And now look at where we are, he shot back, his voice rising. The world is falling apart. People are fighting in the streets. The modified are being hunted like animals, and the unmodified are terrified of what we've created. This isn't saving humanity, Sarah. This is tearing it apart. She recoiled slightly at his words, but the fire in her eyes didn't dim. So what's your solution? You want to just stop? You want to let everything fall apart because you're having second thoughts? Elias stood abruptly, pacing the room. I don't know. I don't have the answers. But I can't sit here and pretend like everything is fine when it's not. We've crossed a line, Sarah. We've changed humanity in ways we can't undo. So what do you want to do? She asked, her voice softer now. He stopped pacing, turning to face her. I don't know, he repeated, his voice heavy with frustration. But I know that I can't be the one to make this decision. Not anymore. The following day, Elias found himself standing before the council, the weight of their collective gaze bearing down on him. They had gathered to hear his decision, to know whether he would authorize the containment measures. The air in the room was thick with tension, and Elias could feel the eyes of the world watching him, waiting for his next move. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had spent the night wrestling with the decision, playing out the scenarios in his head. But no matter how he looked at it, the answer felt wrong. "I can't authorize the containment," he said finally, his voice steady but quiet. The council members exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. The head of the council, a stern-faced man named Anders, leaned forward. "Dr. Graves, you understand the implications of your decision, don't you? If we don't act now, we risk complete societal collapse." "I understand that," Elias said. "But I also understand that if we go down this path, we're only going to make things worse. The modified aren't monsters. They're people we changed. And if we start treating them like criminals, we'll only fuel the fear and hatred that's already tearing us apart." Anders's expression hardened. "They're not the same as us anymore, Dr. Graves. You said it yourself. They've changed in ways we can't fully understand." "Yes, they've changed," Elias agreed. "But that doesn't mean we should treat them like threats. We created them. We owe it to them to find a better solution." The murmurs grew louder, and Elias could see the doubt in their faces. They didn't understand. They couldn't see what he saw. "Then what do you propose?" Anders asked, his voice cold. Elias hesitated. He didn't have a clear answer. But he knew that containment and control weren't the way forward. "We need to open a dialogue," he said slowly. "We need to work with the modified, not against them. Find out what's happening to them, understand it, and figure out how we can help them." Anders snorted, his contempt evident. "And what makes you think they want to talk? They've already turned to violence." "They've turned to violence because they feel threatened," Elias shot back. "If we offer them a chance to be heard, to be treated with dignity, maybe we can find a way to avoid more bloodshed." The room fell silent again, and Elias could feel the weight of their skepticism pressing down on him. He knew it wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the only one he could live with. After what felt like an eternity, Anders finally spoke. "You're playing a dangerous game, Dr. Graves. If this doesn't work, the consequences will be on your shoulders." Elias met his gaze, his resolve hardening. "I understand that, but I'm willing to take that risk." In the days that followed, Elias set out to make good on his promise. He reached out to leaders within the modified community, offering them a chance to come to the table and talk. It wasn't easy. Trust had been eroded on both sides, and many of the modified were reluctant to engage with the very people they believed had betrayed them. But slowly, progress was made. The meetings were tense, fraught with suspicion and anger. But as the conversations continued, something unexpected began to happen. The modified, who had once been seen as emotionless and detached, started to open up. They spoke of their struggles, their fears, their frustrations. They had been changed, yes, but they were still human, still capable of feeling pain, of yearning for acceptance. As Elias listened to their stories, he began to see the truth. They weren't monsters. They were the next step in evolution, an evolution that had come too soon, too abruptly for society to handle. And it was up to him, up to all of them, to find a way to bridge the gap before it was too late. The world stood on the edge of something new, something terrifying and beautiful. And as Elias looked out at the city, the smoke still rising from the streets, he knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The smoke was still rising from the fractured cityscape, but within the battered buildings, something new stirred. Humanity had faced its darkest hour, and in the face of an almost certain extinction, they had done what no species in the galaxy could have predicted. They adapted, evolved, and turned the very source of their destruction into the foundation of their transformation. As Elias stood near the city's edge, watching the horizon, the magnitude of what was happening felt beyond his comprehension. This moment, this shift was no longer about survival alone. It was about something far more profound. There was no denying it now. Humanity was changing in ways no one had foreseen, including himself. And as this realization settled deep within his mind, his thoughts drifted to something larger, something he could feel watching from afar. It was a presence that seemed ancient, like a distant pulse observing everything unfolding. What Elias didn't know was that far beyond Earth, beings were watching, studying, and waiting. Far across the stars, in a distant part of the galaxy that human eyes could not yet fathom, an alien ship hovered in the vast darkness. Its smooth, almost liquid-like surface reflected the starlight around it, pulsating rhythmically with energy. Inside, within its core, sat an observer, a member of an ancient race known as the Elysians. These beings had long transcended the chaos of the physical world. For eons, they had watched over the universe, detached from the suffering and struggles of lesser civilizations. Yet now, something had captured their attention. The observer, as he was known, was connected to his ship in a way that far surpassed the human understanding of technology. His thoughts and the ship's systems were one. He did not merely pilot it, he was the ship. Information flowed into his mind effortlessly, providing him with glimpses into countless worlds. But there was one in particular that now dominated his focus: Earth. Humanity, a species once dismissed as primitive and short-sighted, was undergoing a transformation unlike anything the Elysians had ever seen. The observer had witnessed countless species rise and fall, consumed by their hubris, greed, or an inability to adapt. But humans were different. They didn't merely survive in the face of catastrophe, they thrived. The virus that should have wiped them out had been embraced, twisted, and turned into a catalyst for their evolution. The observer leaned forward, focusing more intently on the streams of data flowing in from Earth. His thoughts raced as he analyzed the changes happening in human biology, their DNA rewriting itself in real time. These changes weren't simply superficial or random. They were deliberate, driven by a force that the Elysians had long since forgotten, something primal, yet deeply intertwined with consciousness itself. For the first time in eons, the observer felt a spark of curiosity. No, it was more than that. It was awe. Back on Earth, Elias moved through the city's remains, his thoughts heavy with questions. The survivors he had met, those who had once been strangers to him, now carried the marks of change on their bodies. What was once a viral infection had rewritten their genetic codes, altering their physiology. Their strength, endurance, and intelligence had all increased. But beyond the physical changes, there was something deeper, something intangible. It wasn't just the people that had changed. The way they moved, the way they interacted with one another, it was as if they were connected by a silent thread of understanding. Words weren't always necessary. Emotions and thoughts flowed between them in ways that Elias couldn't fully grasp. It was unnerving, yet strangely comforting. This was not the human race as it had been. It was something new. His mind returned to the virus, the very thing that had triggered this transformation. How could something so destructive lead to such a profound evolution? What did it mean for the future of their species? The observer continued to analyze the data, but something was bothering him. It wasn't just the physical changes that intrigued him. The humans were evolving, yes, but the virus was only part of the equation. There was something else at play here, something that defied logic and reason. For as long as the Elysians had observed the universe, they had understood life to be bound by certain rules. Yet humanity had shattered those rules with their sheer will to survive. The Elysians had evolved beyond the need for physical bodies long ago, existing now as pure consciousness, their essence housed in the sophisticated machinery of their ships. They no longer needed to fight or adapt. They simply were. Yet, in this state of transcendence, they had become detached from the very struggles that had once defined them. Watching humanity fight tooth and nail for survival stirred something ancient within the observer, a forgotten memory of what it had once meant to be alive. He had seen countless species adapt to their environments, but none had done so with the level of ingenuity and tenacity that humanity displayed. Other species would have accepted their fate, surrendered to the inevitable. But humans, they refused. They fought against the impossible. The virus was a death sentence for any other species, yet humans had transformed it into a means of ascension. What was it that set them apart? Elias found himself at the heart of the city, surrounded by those who had survived. The people looked different now, not just in their physical forms, but in the way they carried themselves. The fear that had once gripped them was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. They had faced death, and they had emerged stronger. He watched as a group of survivors gathered around a fire, sharing stories of their experiences, their hopes, and their fears for the future. They spoke of loved ones lost, of the pain they had endured, but there was no bitterness in their voices. Instead, there was a sense of unity, a recognition that they were all part of something greater now. Elias felt a strange sense of peace wash over him as he listened. The world had changed, but humanity had not been broken. They had been tempered. And in that moment, he realized something. They were no longer bound by the limitations of their past. The virus had opened the door to something new, something unimaginable. But it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about what they would become. The observer, still watching from his distant vantage point, could feel the shift in the collective consciousness of humanity. The virus had acted as a catalyst, but the true transformation lay in their minds. Humanity's evolution wasn't just physical, it was metaphysical. They were beginning to transcend the limitations of their flesh, not by abandoning it, as the Elysians had, but by embracing it. They were rewriting the rules of life itself. This was not something the observer had anticipated. In all his years of watching, he had never encountered a species with this level of resilience, this refusal to accept defeat. It was as if humans were driven by a force that transcended the physical, a force that defied explanation. It wasn't just their will to survive that set them apart. It was their willingness to rewrite the rules of existence itself. The observer felt a deep sense of unease. Humanity's transformation was accelerating, and the implications were far-reaching. They had tapped into something far more profound than the Elysians had realized. They weren't just evolving, they were ascending. Elias stood at the edge of the city once more, looking out at the horizon. The world had changed, but it was still recognizable. The people had changed, but they were still human. And yet, there was something new on the horizon, something that filled him with a sense of both awe and trepidation. He could feel it in the air, in the way the survivors moved and spoke. They were no longer fighting for survival. They were preparing for something greater. Something that he could not yet comprehend, but could sense just beyond the edge of his awareness. As he turned to rejoin the others, a thought struck him, a thought that had been lingering in the back of his mind since the beginning. Perhaps they weren't just surviving. Perhaps they were becoming something more. Something that no one, not even the Elysians, could have predicted. The observer remained still, his thoughts swirling with possibilities. Humanity's future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were no longer a species to be dismissed or ignored. Their resilience, their adaptability, and their sheer will to survive had made them a force to be reckoned with. The Elysians had transcended their physical forms long ago, but perhaps they had lost something in the process. Humanity had reminded them of what it meant to struggle, to fight, and to evolve not out of necessity, but out of sheer determination. As the observer disconnected from the data stream, a single thought echoed through his mind. What comes next? For humanity, and for the galaxy, the answer was both exhilarating and terrifying. The silence in the chamber stretched, thick with the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. Elias stood at the far end, staring out through the transparent dome that encased him. Beyond, the universe stretched infinitely, stars scattered across the cosmic canvas, each one a reminder of humanity's smallness. And yet, in that vastness, Elias knew humanity had shifted something profound. He was a figurehead now, not just for the survival of a species, but for its ascension. The virus that had once threatened extinction had become a turning point, something more profound than anyone could have predicted. But as Elias looked out at the stars, an unease crept into his chest. His influence on human evolution was undeniable, yet it left him more distant than ever, like a passenger watching a ship steer itself. The room behind him was quiet. The others, those who once shared his burden, had moved on, their roles shifting as humanity evolved. And while Elias was revered, even feared by some, he felt himself drifting further from the very people he had helped save. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts, and Elias turned to see the faint outline of Mara stepping into the chamber. Her gaze was calm, but there was an intensity behind her eyes, one that mirrored the questions he himself had been grappling with. "You're still here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she joined him by the dome. Elias nodded, his gaze still fixed on the distant stars. "I can't seem to leave this place." Mara studied him for a moment before speaking again. You've been different since it all changed, Elias. More than just the virus or the evolution, it's like you're pulling away from us." He glanced at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "Maybe I am." She didn't respond right away, giving him the space to elaborate. But when he didn't, she pressed. "Why?" Elias sighed, leaning forward, his hand resting on the cold surface of the dome. "We rewrote everything, Mara. We turned a curse into a gift, and now, look at what we've become. I'm part of this, but I don't know if I can even call myself human anymore. We've changed too much." "Changed, yes," she agreed, her tone firm but understanding. "But isn't that the point? Survival is about adaptation." "But adaptation to what?" Elias replied, his voice quiet but sharp. "To some grand design? To the whims of the universe? Or did we just twist ourselves into something the cosmos wasn't expecting, something unnatural?" Mara frowned. "You're starting to sound like one of them." He glanced at her, curious. "One of who?" "The aliens," she replied. "They've been watching us, you know? They're not like us. They've lived in balance, in harmony, with their environments, their planets, their systems. We've shaken something in them, Elias. We're not following the rules, and it frightens them." That revelation didn't surprise him. In fact, it confirmed the vague sense of disquiet that had been gnawing at the back of his mind. The aliens had always been out there, observing, existing within their own established paradigms, never pushing beyond their limits. And then came humanity, a species that had faced extinction, and instead of succumbing, rewrote the very fabric of its existence. "They fear us," Mara continued, her voice softer now. "Not because of our technology or our strength, but because we defy what they believe is the natural order. We refuse to stay within the lines, and they don't know what that means for the universe." Elias looked back out at the stars, his mind racing. "Maybe they're right to fear us. What if we've become something the universe wasn't prepared for? What if we're the aberration?" Mara crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "An aberration? Or are we exactly what the universe needs, a reminder that nothing is set in stone?" Her words struck a chord, but Elias wasn't ready to accept them. Not yet. "You think this is what we're meant to be? That this was the plan all along?" "I don't believe in plans," Mara said, her gaze unwavering. "I believe in choices, and we've made ours. Maybe that makes us dangerous, but maybe it's what will push us further than anyone else has ever gone." Elias remained silent, her words sinking into him. Humanity's transformation wasn't part of some grand cosmic blueprint, at least not in the way the aliens might have thought. But it was undeniable that they had altered the course of their existence. The virus had forced them to make a choice: die, or evolve into something new, and they had chosen the latter. But that choice, while offering survival, had also distanced them from what they once were. Elias felt that distance more than anyone, a growing rift between who he had been and who he was now. His body, enhanced beyond human limitations, felt like a stranger's, and his mind was constantly racing with thoughts too fast, too expansive for him to fully grasp. "Do you ever wonder," he asked after a long pause, "if we're meant to have a role in the universe, or if we've just taken one that wasn't ours?" Mara sighed, leaning against the dome next to him. "I wonder that every day, but then I think about all we've been through. The universe didn't give us a role, Elias. We carved one out for ourselves. Maybe that's what makes us different. We don't wait for permission." Her words resonated with something deep within him. Humanity had never been one to ask for permission, to wait for things to happen. They had always been driven by the need to explore, to push beyond boundaries, even when those boundaries weren't meant to be crossed. It was what made them resilient, what made them survive when so many others would have perished. And yet, as Elias stood there, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still on the edge of something much larger, something they didn't yet understand. The universe was vast, and despite all they had learned, all they had become, they were still only beginning to scratch the surface of its mysteries. Mara's voice broke through his thoughts. "You're thinking about them, aren't you? The ones watching us?" Elias nodded. "They see us as a wild card, a species that doesn't play by the rules. Maybe we don't, she said, her tone almost defiant. But maybe that's why we'll survive when others won't. He glanced at her, the fire in her words sparking something in him. You really think we're the ones who will outlast them? The ones who will rise above? She met his gaze, her expression resolute. I think we're the ones who will decide our own fate, and that terrifies them. The thought lingered in the air between them, heavy with possibility. For so long, humanity had looked outward, toward the stars, searching for answers, for guidance. But now, as they stood on the brink of something far greater, Elias realized that the answers weren't out there. They were within. Humanity had become something new, something the universe had not anticipated. And with that transformation came a profound responsibility. Not to the stars or the galaxies, but to themselves, to decide who they wanted to be, not just in the grand scheme of the cosmos, but in the small, quiet moments that define them as individuals. As Elias turned his gaze back to the stars, a sense of clarity began to form. The universe was vast, yes, but humanity's place in it was not determined by the natural order or some grand design. It was determined by the choices they made, by their willingness to challenge the very fabric of existence. And that, more than anything, was what set them apart. Elias stood in silence, Mara beside him, both of them staring out into the endless void. The stars, distant and unfeeling, seemed to pulse with a quiet indifference. But Elias no longer saw them as indifferent. He saw them as a reminder that humanity, for all its flaws and imperfections, was capable of carving its own path in the universe. And perhaps that was the greatest gift of all. Elias remained at the dome, letting Mara's words settle. There was something stirring within him, a deeper resonance with the idea that humanity's defiance of the natural order wasn't something to regret, but something to embrace. Still, there was a lingering doubt that he couldn't easily shake. He had always believed that the universe moved according to a greater plan, but as the years went on, he began to wonder whether they had simply slipped out of sync with it. The universe seemed indifferent to human struggles, and now, with their newfound power, it had become apparent that humanity might never truly fit into the grand cosmic scheme. They had evolved into something unexpected, something no one had predicted. Elias felt more than just physically different. His mind seemed to transcend the limitations of what he once thought possible. He could feel his consciousness expanding, touching the boundaries of reality itself, but it left him unsettled. Mara, sensing his unease, broke the silence again. It's not wrong to feel lost in all of this. We've changed so much, and we're only starting to understand the magnitude of it. Elias rubbed the back of his neck, trying to relieve some of the tension that had been building. I don't know if we've changed in the right way. We survived, yes, but at what cost? I feel disconnected, like I've become something other than human. You're still you, Mara said quietly, her voice gentle but firm. We all feel it. The distance between who we were and who we are now. But change isn't always comfortable. What matters is how we choose to live with it. He looked at her, her expression resolute. Her conviction was admirable, and yet it made him realize just how far he had drifted from that sense of certainty. Mara still clung to the hope that they were shaping a future worth fighting for, but Elias couldn't help but question if they had taken a path that led them away from their humanity. The aliens watching us, he murmured, his voice low. They're wondering the same thing, aren't they? They see us as something unpredictable, something dangerous. Mara nodded. They don't know what to make of us. To them, we're a species that refuses to fit into their understanding of how life should progress. But that doesn't mean they're right. Just because we don't follow their rules doesn't mean we're an aberration. Maybe, Elias conceded, though his doubt still lingered. But we've rewritten everything, Mara. What if we've become something we can't control? What if we've unleashed something that even we don't fully understand? Mara turned away from the stars and faced him directly. Then we deal with it, like we always have. The virus could have wiped us out, but instead, we turned it into something else. Something that gave us a chance. You were part of that choice, Elias. You helped guide us to where we are. That's just it, Elias said. his voice quiet but charged with emotion. "I don't know if I can keep guiding us anymore. I feel like I've lost touch with what made us human." Mara's brow furrowed, concern etched into her features. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "What does it mean to be human, then? Is it the way we look, the things we feel, or is it the choices we make in the face of adversity?" Elias paused, her question hanging in the air. What did it mean to be human now? They had transcended the physical limitations of their former selves, but did that make them less human? Or was humanity defined by something more abstract, something that couldn't be taken away by mere biological changes? Mara continued, sensing his hesitation. "We've always been more than our bodies, Elias. Humanity has been defined by our ability to adapt, to push beyond what we thought was possible. That's what makes us human, the ability to change, to evolve, and to keep going even when everything tells us we shouldn't." Elias couldn't deny the truth in her words. Humanity had always been driven by the desire to survive, to move forward despite the odds. But something about this new phase of their evolution felt different. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about transformation on a level they had never experienced before, and that transformation had left them untethered from the very things that once grounded them. "We've become something else," Elias said, more to himself than to Mara. "We've adapted, but in doing so, we've lost something." "What do you think we've lost?" Mara asked gently. "Our connection to the rest of the universe," he replied. "We've evolved beyond what we were, but now we don't fit anywhere. The aliens see it. They're watching us because they don't know if we belong anymore." Mara stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "Maybe we don't belong anywhere, but maybe that's okay. Maybe we're not meant to follow someone else's path. We're carving our own way, and that scares them." Elias exhaled slowly, the weight of her words settling in. She was right. They had become something the universe hadn't expected, something the aliens couldn't understand. But perhaps that was the very thing that made them powerful. Humanity had never followed the rules, never stayed within the lines of what was expected. That unpredictability was their greatest strength, and perhaps also their greatest curse. He turned to face her fully. "Do you ever wonder if we've gone too far? If we've pushed beyond what we were meant to be?" Mara shrugged. "Maybe. But what's the alternative? To stay stagnant? To wait for the universe to decide our fate for us? That's not who we are, Elias. We've always been the ones to push the boundaries, to ask the questions no one else is willing to ask. And now the universe is asking questions about us," he said with a faint smile. Mara smiled back, though there was a seriousness behind it. "Exactly. And they're afraid of the answers. But that's not our problem. We don't have to fit into their version of what life should be." Her words carried a weight of finality, and Elias felt a shift in himself as they settled. The universe, the aliens, even the stars, none of them could dictate what humanity was meant to become. They had carved their own path, and while it was uncertain, it was theirs. For the first time in a long while, Elias felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they weren't an aberration. Maybe they were the next step in the universe's evolution, not a mistake, but a new chapter in the cosmic story. He turned back to the stars, his mind clearer than before. The aliens, watching from their distant worlds, didn't understand humanity. They saw them as a wild card, a species that refused to play by the rules. But that wasn't a flaw. It was a strength. Mara stood beside him, her presence grounding him. She had always been the voice of reason, the one who reminded him of who they were, even when the world seemed to be shifting beneath their feet. "Do you think they'll ever stop watching us?" Elias asked after a long pause. Mara shook her head. "No. We're too unpredictable. They'll keep watching, waiting to see what we do next. But that's their problem, not ours." Elias nodded, the corners of his lips twitching into a faint smile. "Then let them watch." The two of them stood in silence, staring out into the vastness of space, the stars glimmering like distant memories. The universe was vast, and in that vastness, humanity had carved out a place for itself, not by following the rules, but by breaking them. And maybe, Elias thought, That was exactly what the universe needed. Hours later, after Mara had left, Elias remained alone in the chamber. The quiet hum of the ship's systems was the only sound, a faint reminder of the technology that now governed their existence. He stood at the dome, his thoughts drifting in and out like the ebb of a distant tide. He had been so consumed by the questions of what they had become, of whether they still fit within the grand scheme of things, that he had forgotten something vital. The universe was not a closed system. It was constantly changing, evolving, just like them. And if humanity didn't fit into the old order, then perhaps they were meant to create a new one. The stars, cold and distant, no longer felt indifferent to him. Instead, they seemed like possibilities, each one representing a future that had yet to be written. Maybe humanity wasn't an aberration after all. Maybe they were simply the next step in the universe's own evolution, not bound by the past, but free to define their own future. And as Elias stood there, staring out at the endless expanse of space, he realized that the answers he sought weren't out there in the stars. They were within him, within all of them. The universe had given them the tools, and it was up to humanity to decide how to use them. The future was theirs to shape. The quiet of space felt endless, as if the vastness of the stars themselves swallowed any notion of time. Elias remained at the observation deck, his gaze fixed outward. Mara had left hours ago, but her words stayed with him, replaying in his mind like an unsolvable puzzle. He couldn't shake the sensation that, despite all the progress humanity had made, they stood on the precipice of something far larger than themselves, something unknown and perhaps unknowable. In many ways, humanity had always sought to unravel the mysteries of existence. From the moment they stepped beyond Earth's atmosphere, they had pushed against the edges of what they understood, never satisfied with the boundaries the universe imposed on them. Now, they had become more than they ever thought possible, stronger, faster, more resilient, but also distant from the beings they once were. Elias knew he had played a pivotal role in that transformation. The genetic modifications, the advancements that had pulled humanity back from the brink of extinction, had also created a fracture within him. He had saved his people, but at a cost no one could have predicted. He felt revered by some, hated by others. Every step forward had been shadowed by the weight of the choices he had made. He closed his eyes, trying to still the thoughts swirling in his mind. The void stretched out before him, vast and indifferent. It had always been like that, hadn't it? No matter how much humanity had evolved, no matter how far they ventured into the cosmos, the universe remained cold and distant, offering no answers. And yet, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something monumental, and perhaps something dangerous. The aliens had always been cautious around humanity, observing them from afar with a mixture of curiosity and fear. But recently, that fear had become more palpable. It was as though humanity's rapid ascension was not just unexpected, but unwanted. There was an unspoken boundary, a limit to the knowledge they were supposed to acquire, and they were fast approaching it. The thought unsettled Elias. What if they had already crossed that line? What if the pursuit of knowledge, the very thing that had driven them for centuries, was leading them toward destruction? A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. The door slid open, and footsteps approached behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Selene, one of the key architects of the genetic modification program, and one of the few people Elias trusted to speak honestly with him, stood quietly at his side. "You've been here for hours," she said, her voice soft but direct. Elias didn't respond immediately. He kept his gaze fixed on the stars, as though searching for answers in their distant light. "I can't stop thinking," he finally said, "about everything we've done, about where we're going." Selene crossed her arms, leaning against the railing beside him. "You're not the only one. There's a lot of uncertainty right now. People are asking questions we don't have answers to." Elias nodded. He had expected as much. The people were restless, their minds swirling with the same doubts that plagued him. The modifications had given them strength beyond what any human had ever possessed, but with that strength came a deeper awareness of the universe around them. They were beginning to perceive things that had once been beyond their comprehension, forces, dimensions, realities that defied their understanding. And with that awareness came fear. "What if we've gone too far?" Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if we've opened doors that were never meant to be opened?" Selene sighed, her expression thoughtful. "That's always a possibility, but isn't that what humanity has always done? We push boundaries, we challenge the status quo. Sometimes it leads to destruction, but other times it leads to discovery, to growth." Elias turned to look at her, his brow furrowed. "But what if this time the cost is too high?" Selene met his gaze, her eyes sharp and steady. "We don't know that yet. We can't know. But sitting here and questioning every decision we've made isn't going to change anything. We have to keep moving forward." Elias shook his head. "Forward into what?" "The aliens are watching us, Selene. They're afraid. They think we're going to unravel something that was never meant to be touched." Selene frowned, her lips pressed into a thin line. "And you think they're right?" "I don't know," Elias admitted, frustration seeping into his voice. "But I can't shake this feeling that we're standing on the edge of something dangerous. We've gained so much, but at what point does the pursuit of knowledge become a curse?" Selene was silent for a moment, considering his words. When she finally spoke, her tone was measured, deliberate. "Knowledge is power, Elias. And power has always been a double-edged sword. It can save, or it can destroy. But it's not the knowledge itself that's dangerous. It's what we choose to do with it." Elias clenched his fists, feeling the weight of her words. She was right, of course. The pursuit of knowledge had always been fraught with risk. But this time, the stakes felt higher, far higher than they had ever been before. The universe was vast and filled with secrets, and humanity was on the brink of uncovering some of its darkest ones. "The modifications," Elias said slowly, "they were meant to save us. But what if they've done more than that? What if they've set us on a path that we can't control?" Selene didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched him carefully, her eyes searching his face for some sign of where his thoughts were leading him. "Do you regret it?" she asked after a long pause. "The choices you made?" Elias exhaled sharply. "I don't know. I did what I had to do. We were dying, Selene. The virus was wiping us out. The modifications were our only chance. But now you're wondering if that chance came at a price we didn't fully understand." He nodded, the tension in his chest growing. "Yes." Selene uncrossed her arms, her gaze drifting back to the stars. "Maybe it did. Maybe we've become something we weren't meant to be. But maybe that's not a bad thing. The universe is full of unknowns, Elias. We were never going to fit into the neat little boxes the aliens wanted us to stay in." Elias rubbed his temple, the ache in his head intensifying. "But what if the knowledge we're uncovering, what if it leads to our destruction?" Selene's expression softened, her voice taking on a more compassionate tone. "Then we'll face that when it comes. But you can't live in fear of the unknown, Elias. That's not who you are. You've always been the one to push forward, to challenge what others said couldn't be done." "And look where it's gotten us," Elias muttered bitterly. "It's gotten us here," Selene countered, her tone firm. "Alive. Stronger than we ever were before. We're not the same species we once were. But that doesn't mean we're doomed. It just means we're evolving." Elias fell silent, her words hanging in the air between them. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that the changes they had undergone were part of a natural progression, that they were simply adapting to the universe in the way humanity always had. But there was a part of him, a deep, gnawing part that couldn't let go of the fear that they had crossed a line they weren't supposed to. "What if we're becoming something we can't control?" he asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. Selene reached out and placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "Then we control what we can, and we trust that we'll figure out the rest as we go. We've always faced the unknown, Elias. This is no different." Elias closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. She was right. They had always faced the unknown, but this time it felt different. The universe wasn't just indifferent to them anymore, it was watching, waiting, and perhaps preparing for what was to come. He opened his eyes and looked back out at the stars, his mind heavy with the weight of the choices that lay ahead. The aliens feared them, feared what they might discover, and perhaps they were right to. But fear had never stopped humanity before. It wouldn't stop them now. "Whatever happens," Elias said quietly, "we have to be ready. The universe isn't going to wait for us to figure things out." Selene nodded, her expression serious. "We will be. We've come too far to turn back now." As the two of them stood side by side, gazing into the infinite expanse of space, Elias couldn't help but feel a strange sense of both dread and hope. The universe held secrets they were only beginning to uncover, and those secrets could either elevate them to heights they had never imagined or destroy them entirely. But one thing was certain: there was no turning back. Humanity had crossed the threshold, and whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The room was silent, a silence not born from peace, but from the gravity of what lay before Elias. The council chambers, once a place of debate, sometimes heated, sometimes serene, had become a vacuum, stripped of all sound, except for the slight, rhythmic hum of the machinery that kept the structure afloat among the stars. Elias sat alone at the head of the chamber, his eyes drawn to the shimmering holographic projections that encircled him. The galaxy spread out in brilliant, intricate detail, stars pulsing faintly like distant embers. He could see the pathways that humanity had carved through the cosmos, colonies, territories, even war zones, all now woven into the fabric of a larger existence. This was no longer just the story of Earth, of human survival. It had become a tale of galactic significance, a shift in the balance of power across the universe. But power, as Elias knew too well, carried with it a shadow. Messages flooded in constantly, reports of new alliances, emerging enemies, and mysterious existential threats that flickered on the edge of human consciousness, just beyond reach. Some spoke of alien civilizations watching from afar, others of the ancient powers humanity was beginning to awaken. The galaxy, vast and filled with promise, was also a cauldron of instability. There were whispers anxious, fearful that the very fabric of existence might unravel with humanity's relentless pursuit of knowledge and dominance. He leaned forward, fingers tapping against the metallic surface in front of him. His mind drifted back to the conversation with General Kyra just hours ago. "We're receiving new transmissions from the outer colonies," Kyra had said, her tone grim. "Strange phenomena, stars dying prematurely, gravitational anomalies. Some of our scientists believe it's something we've triggered, something tied to our modifications." Elias had met her gaze then, his expression unreadable. "What are they suggesting?" "That we've tampered with forces we don't understand, that we're pushing too far, too fast." The words echoed now as he sat alone. The modifications Kyra had referred to were the result of his own design's genetic enhancements, artificial intelligence integration, the very tools that had allowed humanity to become not just survivors, but apex predators in the cosmic landscape. They had outgrown their chains, surpassed their limitations, but at what cost? The door hissed open, interrupting his thoughts. Dr. Merrick, the lead scientist responsible for overseeing much of humanity's technological evolution, stepped inside. He was a slight man, dwarfed by the vastness of the chamber, yet his presence carried weight. Elias looked up, catching the tension in the man's expression. "We need to talk," Merrick began, his voice low. "It's about the latest batch of modified individuals." Elias motioned for him to continue. "There are complications, psychological side effects that we didn't foresee. Some of them are beginning to question their own identities. Others, well, they're becoming something else. They're no longer human in the traditional sense. Their minds, their instincts, everything is evolving beyond what we predicted. It's starting to destabilize certain regions. The population doesn't know how to deal with them." Elias closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the revelation settle in his chest. He had seen this coming, hadn't he? The modifications had been necessary, he had told himself. Survival demanded adaptation. But what happened when adaptation outpaced understanding? Merrick stepped closer, his voice softening. Elias, you've always been the guiding force behind this. But now, some of the council members are questioning whether we should continue. They believe we've crossed a line, that we're playing God. Elias opened his eyes, staring at the man. And what do you believe, Merrick? The scientist hesitated. I believe we've opened a door that can't be closed, but we need to be careful. We need to ask ourselves if we're ready for what's on the other side. Elias stood, walking slowly toward the holographic projection of the galaxy. He traced the path of a human colony on the far edge of the known universe with his finger. There was never any question that we'd face consequences for what we've done, he said quietly. But the universe was never going to wait for us to be ready. We had to act, adapt or perish. Merrick watched him, his eyes searching for any sign of doubt. So what now? Do we continue down this path? Elias turned to face him, his expression calm but resolute. The question isn't whether we continue, Merrick. The question is whether we can guide what we've created. Later, Elias found himself in the observation deck, staring out into the endless expanse of space. He had always come here when the weight of his decisions became too much to bear. The quiet vastness of the universe had a way of putting things into perspective. But today, the silence felt different. Ominous, almost suffocating. He wasn't alone for long. A familiar presence appeared beside him, Naira, the enigmatic counselor who had long been his confidant. She was one of the few who understood the deeper philosophical struggle that had plagued him since the beginning. As a leader, he was revered and hated in equal measure. His legacy was one of duality, a creator of new worlds and possibilities, yet a harbinger of destruction for those who stood in the way. Naira's voice broke the silence. You've changed the course of human history, but now you face the hardest decision of all. Elias didn't turn to look at her. What decision is that? Whether to keep steering the ship or let humanity find its own way. He sighed. If I step away now, what happens? Chaos? Do they tear themselves apart? Or do they survive, evolve, without me? Naira tilted her head slightly, considering his words. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. You've given them tools, but you've also shielded them from the full consequences of their actions. You can't guide them forever. I never wanted to be a god, Elias whispered, his voice almost lost to the void beyond the window. And yet, here you are, the architect of humanity's future. Elias finally turned to her, his gaze intense. What if I've made a mistake? What if this evolution I've guided them through, what if it destroys them in the end? Naira met his eyes, unflinching. That's the burden of creation, to build something and not know how it will end. But isn't that also the beauty of it? The unknown? Elias fell silent, his thoughts swirling. The edge of eternity lay before him not just in the stars, but in the choices he had made, the legacy he would leave behind. He had been given the chance to guide humanity's future, but the question remained, should he? Naira's voice softened, more human than he had ever heard it. The universe is vast, Elias, and it's filled with mysteries we've only just begun to uncover. You've brought us to the edge of something great, something terrifying, but it's up to them now. You've done your part. He nodded slowly, feeling the weight lift, if only slightly. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps the time had come to step back, to let humanity find its own way. But the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. What if, without his guidance, they strayed too far? What if the very tools he had given them led to their undoing? The universe stretched out before him, vast and unknowable. And as Elias stood on the edge of eternity, he realized that the answers he sought might never come.